Today, are junior doctors right to go on strike? How much will the government increase public sector pay? And should Ukraine show more gratitude? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Catherine Fletcher, the Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting, General Secretary of the TUC Paul Novak and Reem Ibrahim of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today, junior doctors begin the longest strike in NHS history. The 5-day walkout will mean significant disruption for patients.
If Steve Barclay can right now, or throughout the course of the day, say that a junior doctor is worth £20 an hour, we will call off the strikes.
It comes as the government is poised to announce public sector pay increases for next year. But where will the money come from? Also today, the Defence Secretary says Ukraine could show more gratitude. Is he right? And this man could be the next Health Secretary. But is that the limit of his ambition? Let's start by showing you the front pages. As you can see, one story dominates in the blanket coverage that we've seen over the last 5 days. The question of the identity of the unnamed presenter at the centre of the media storm was resolved by Hugh Edwards' wife in a statement yesterday after fevered speculation. My opening question to the panel is, have the laws on reporting these kinds of stories done their job or been found wanting, Catherine?
I'm acutely conscious in commenting on this that there's a man whose wife has said he's seeking medical treatment. So I'm instinctively quite leery to start debating moving forward. I want the BBC to be able to conduct its own investigation, and I want to make sure that no further harms come from anybody involved in this. So I'm not... Let's understand the facts of it, and then let's debate the kind of ins and outs when the dust has settled a bit.
But broadly, do you think the laws as they stand are doing the job that they are supposed to do when covering these sorts of complex stories?
You mean in terms of the fact that 1 in 6 of the British people had heard a rumour about the identity in advance? I think social media challenges us in lots of ways, and I think there are risks with that, as well as kind of freedom of speech arguments. I think we should just be compassionate and careful, both to the individuals involved that perhaps have engaged in behaviours are not called, but also the individuals that are still coming forward reporting things that are of concern to them.
Where are you, Wes?
This is going to be a boring programme if we carry on like this. I actually broadly agree with what Catherine's just said. At this stage, I don't think we know whether or not the Sun's got this right, whether the BBC's got this right. We have been subjected to days and days of speculation, some really quite startling allegations reported in the Sun newspaper, lots of questions facing the BBC, which is why I think the investigation's right. I think at the end of this, though, whatever the outcome and whatever facts emerge, there are inevitably going to be some people who look pretty stupid as a result of things they have said about these events on social media without being in full possession of the facts. I've absolutely no desire to join those people with idle speculation. On the question of media regulation, I think the media have to report responsibly. I also think as legislators, we have to regulate carefully in the context of media freedom in this country. And I think any sort of press regulation, media regulation, is something that, as elected politicians, we should enter into very cautiously, because you don't want to be in a position where you are effectively having a chilling effect on free media and free press and an important pillar of democracy. But I think once the dust has settled, once the facts emerge, once the inquiries are reported, I think that would be the right moment for people at the BBC, The Sun and elsewhere in the media, and social media platforms, quite rightly, reflect on exactly what happened here and whether or not everyone got this right.
There is a question for government about images. I think there are some fake images knocking around, that perhaps have been generated by AI, and I think that's something we are looking at. Yeah, but
Paul, where are you?
I don't think you can legislate for bad journalism and bad editorial decisions. And I mean, I don't read The Sun. I don't buy The Sun. I wouldn't give an interview for The Sun in the treatment of the Hillsborough families, the way they've demonised striking workers. But I think at the end of the day, Hugh Edwards has clearly got personal issues. Potentially he's got professional issues, and the BBC will have to deal with those and carry out its investigation. The Sun, though, in its coverage, inferred that there were criminal issues at play here, and that clearly doesn't appear to be the case.
Well, because the police have said that they haven't found any evidence of criminality.
What the Sun's motivations are, and I think partly it's about salaciousness. I think partly it's about having a pop at the BBC, I'll be quite frank. So, as I say, you can put all the guidelines in place that you want, the codes of practice. Bad editorial decisions, I think, are bad editorial decisions.
Reem?
I mean, I have an incredible amount of sympathy for the family and all of those individuals that are involved. I think it's very difficult. I think we in the media need to not be speculating. We don't want trial by media. I think that we need to also be aware of the fact that the Metropolitan Police have also withdrawn the investigation, so we know nothing unlawful has happened. So really, this is a matter of morality. It's a matter of BBC protocol, and therefore it's a matter for the BBC to investigate.
Let's talk about the story that will be uppermost in many people's minds, and that's the junior doctors' strike. The BBC headline: junior doctors in England start 5-day strike. It's the longest ever in England. They say the government's refusal to talk ahead of the strike was baffling and frustrating. Well, you can understand that, can't you, Catherine? Why wasn't the government prepared to do that?
So they are asking for a 35% pay rise and, have engaged in negotiations. But if they are striking in advance of what the pay review bodies are coming out with, and they are refusing to either engage on anything below that sum, I mean, where would it end if 35% is a reasonable demand?
And that precludes sitting around a table talking to them.
I think, well, the conversations have been had, but when you're just kind of running around holding a sword of Damocles, people use this service. There are people in pain. You know, it may risk us being able to kind of cut the COVID backlogs. There is a judgment call to be made about when people are being unreasonable versus when people are actually engaging positively on the topic. But just one thing. At uni, I shared with medical students. I saw how hard they worked to get the degree. I saw how hard they worked to go through their career. The junior doctors should know that they're incredibly valued, and I am slightly worried that the union, BMA leadership is slightly... he's not necessarily doing them the service that the British people hold them in the esteem.
I'm going to come to you, obviously, Paul. I just want to get Wes's thoughts on this. You'll have heard there in the headlines, Dr Arjan Singh, member of the BMA Doctors Committee, he said to BBC Breakfast that if Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, says doctors are worth £20 an hour, they'd call off the strikes. Put like that, that sounds reasonable. Is that what you would offer?
Well, there's got to be a negotiation, and these problems have been a decade in the making because pay hasn't kept up in line with inflation, not just for junior doctors, but right across the economy, public and private sector.
So are they worth £20? Are they worth £20 an hour?
Look, we would be willing, and you can judge us on our record on this. When we were last in government, we delivered year-on-year pay increases. In fact, the last Labour government delivered full pay restoration compared to where the previous Conservative government had. Why? Because we got the economy growing and we made sure that that growth was reinvested into public services and reinvested into the industries and jobs that motor the UK economy.
And
the reason we've got a high tax economy is we've got a low growth economy. The reason why we've got a low pay economy is we've got a low growth economy. All roads lead back to growth, and that's why Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have rightly said this is the #1 priority for the next Labour government.
In this economic situation, which you may inherit, are they worth £20 an hour?
And this is why I've said, because I think they're calling for 35%, and I've said I've got to be honest, if I were the Health Secretary today, I would not be able to deliver 35% overnight, but we would be willing to negotiate. And what I cannot understand is why, whether it was the nurses, the junior doctors, now the consultants, why Rishi Sunak has not dedicated a minute of his own time into negotiating with the NHS workforce. He sat down with Boris Johnson to negotiate gongs and peerages for all of his cronies, but he has not spent a minute focused on these negotiations, and that's a dereliction of leadership.
Keir Starmer said that Wales NHS was going to be his blueprint for government. The waiting lists are worse in Wales. The employment is worse in Wales. The service is failing on all of the measures compared to England. I think what you need to be doing is setting forward a positive plan. We've got to, as you've said, balance what the taxpayers pay to the public sector. 35% is bad, and you can't support it. But you've got you've got us doing what the NHS wants us to do, 2.4 billion into that long-term workforce plan. That's their plan that we're supporting. And the idea that the Prime Minister needs to personally engage with a union leadership that's making outrageous demands for him to be working hard on the problem, that's for the birds. Right. 2.4 billion is a lot of money.
Well, let Wes respond.
Well, I would just say a couple of things. One is, this isn't the BMA leadership or indeed the Royal College of Nursing or Unison's leadership saying, we demand this for our members. These are strike ballots that have been delivered on extraordinarily high turnouts and a very high proportion of the vote in favour.
But you don't support the doctors' strike, do you?
I wish they weren't going on strike. Right. At no point have I blamed them, though, Joe. I don't blame the junior doctors. I don't blame the nurses. I don't blame the consultants.
But you don't support the strike.
What choice have they got when the government won't sit down and negotiate? And that's why we didn't have national strikes in the NHS under the last Labour government, because we treated people like grown-ups, we treated them with respect, and because we had the economy growing, we were able to invest in the pay of our people.
Did you have a 35% pay demand?
We delivered full pay restoration under the last Labour government.
Yeah, but it wasn't 35%, was it?
We got the economy growing, and that is the root of all of the problems, and I'm afraid that's why I say it's been more than a decade in the making.
In essence, what you're saying is the difference between the two of you is tone. It's about how you deal with people.
It's record.
But you wouldn't do anything materially different.
It's record, Joe. You can judge our record of 13 years in government versus 13 years of the Conservatives, where we delivered in fair pay, we didn't have a retention crisis, we didn't have a recruitment crisis.
We also inherited your economic mess.
We did have the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction in the history of the National Health Service.
All right, let me just play you a clip from a video that the BMA have put out. They're encouraging striking junior doctors to perhaps only picket for one day, but have alternative suggestions for how they should spend that time. Let's have a look.
By concentrating our efforts on one day, we'll maximise our impact and show the government our resolve is as strong as ever.
On the Friday and Monday, we encourage you to spend time with your colleagues socially. Have a five-a-side, go for a strike hike, get together for a picnic, whatever you feel like. Or if you do feel that we would like to picket, that's great too. Just know there is no pressure to do so. Spending time with your colleagues is an equally valuable use of time during this challenging period.
What did you make of that video, Paul? Is that going to get public support?
Well, I think it's very clear that those striking junior doctors do have public support, and they've maintained public support.
And the video?
Yeah, well, I don't think that people are going to look at that video and draw any conclusions from it whatsoever. What I know is, and I've been on the picket lines not with junior doctors, but with paramedics, with physios, there's a huge amount of public support out there, and that's because the public realise the problems in our NHS, those 130,000 staff vacancies, aren't the fault of junior doctors or any other NHS professional. I'm afraid it's 13 years of underinvestment and understaffing in our NHS. Now,
absolutely not.
Let me finish this point. I am not an expert in health policy, but what I have done for 30 years is negotiate with employers, and I don't know any private sector employer, for example, that would refuse to sit down with the union because they don't like the union's opening offer, or indeed refuse to negotiate with the union because its members are taking industrial action. The only way to resolve any strike is by sitting down, negotiating and reaching agreement.
And they are asking for a 35% pay increase, which I'm sorry is not a serious ask. 35% is absolutely unacceptable. Now, when we're thinking about public sector pay increases, we've got to think about the trade-offs. Either we have to increase taxes in order to pay for public spending. Public spending now at the moment is already 46% of GDP. That's up by 10% from the year 2000. So when we really have to think about these trade-offs, or we have to cut spending in some other areas. Now, it's unfair to say that the NHS is underfunded. We spend record levels of taxpayer money in the NHS.
165 billion, 90% up since 2010.
Huge amounts of money on the NHS. Now, I've got to say, it's actually quite nice to hear a Labour politician actually arguing for NHS reform. And I think that what I would really like to hear from the Labour Party is actually what that reform really means.
Wes?
Yeah, it's a big shift from, you know, where we are as a health system, pretty much top of the charts in terms of spending on hospitals compared to other OECD countries. But you look at primary care, community services, mental health, social care, capital, crucially diagnostic.
But you're not going to spend
at the bottom
more than has been allocated, are you?
Lagging behind. Well, that's not true. Rachel Reeves, very early on in her time as Shadow Chancellor, made a serious down payment on the NHS budget by saying we would use some of the revenues from abolishing the non-dom tax status,
but we genuinely
by abolishing the carried profits loophole to invest in mental health
compared
services.
to the overall budget.
But the reason, Joe, I've never disputed that part of the lesson from the last Labour government to deliver those short waiting times is about investment, but it is also about reform. And I want to see a big shift from excessive focus on hospital to community services, a big shift from analogue services to digital services, and a big shift from simply focusing on sickness to preventing long-term ill health.
Can I make a point about public finances? Because Reem mentioned the issue around taxation. The reality is we're in a cost of living crisis, but not everybody in this country has lived through a cost of living crisis. Dividends have risen 3 times faster than wages. Chief executives' pay has soared. I think there's a sensible debate to be had about taxation in this country with those with the broadest shoulders to pay.
We already have the highest
tax burden. And the 35%, you know full well, the 35% Reem is a red herring, because no one thinks that the government is going to deliver a 35% pay rise tomorrow. What they want to do is have a serious conversation about pay restoration, but also solving that recruitment and retention crisis. You're not going to be able to wish it away.
Well, I think when it comes to the NHS specifically, I mean, we clearly the NHS isn't working. We've got over 7.3 million people on waiting lists. It's nice to hear Labour politicians actually talking about what this reform could potentially look like. It's nice to hear that actually the solution isn't just more of our hard-earned taxpayer money being thrown into what is effectively a bureaucratic black hole. What we need instead is to actually think about what kind of other systems we could seek to emulate in the United Kingdom. Look at the Australian system, not the US. There are more than 2 countries in the world, Paul. We could think about the Singaporean system, or Australia, or Germany, or Sweden, who have public and private partnerships that actually work better, deliver for their people, and allow patients to have more choice.
Would you think about those systems? Is that the radical reform you're talking about? You seem to have Ream support.
It's not the model of funding or the model of free at the point of use National Health Service needs to change. It's how the money's spent. It's how the system's set up. It's how patients interact with the NHS. More primary care, more access to GPs,
people
more
not paying for GP appointments, or the private sector level of involvement that you are in favour of?
It's one of those things I'm just not prepared to compromise on. A National Health Service that's free at the point of use, I think, is the thing that people in this country really value. And when I went through my own experience with kidney cancer just a couple of years ago, I had loads of things to worry about. The one thing I didn't have to worry about was the bill. That's not the thing that needs to change. That's not the thing that's broken the NHS.
We're in danger of agreeing again.
Right.
We're in danger of agreeing again.
We're allowed.
I know, it's shocking. Free at the point of use NHS, it's one of our national assets. It's £165 billion a year we spend supporting it. That's 90% more. We're already talking about it using AI in, for example, in radiology.
More private sector involvement?
No. More technological improvement. Go-ahead GP services that are already, the NHS app that's allowing you to book appointments, do repeat prescriptions, taking that admin out of the NHS. I've got friends that work there, and the thing that they absolutely go mad about is the amount of time that they don't spend with patients on the bureaucracy in the NHS, but you have to invest to achieve that, and 90% more than 2010, as well as a set of plans and supporting the NHS's own plans, like the long-term workforce plan.
But still,
that's really important.
But still, the strikes go on. Let me just show you this headline in Reuters. UK rules allowing agency workers to cover strikes are unlawful. That's just been announced in the High Court. The government lost its case, Catherine. Were they trying to undermine strike action?
We have to find... Government is not a series of unallied positive choices. We've got to find a balance between the right to strike for Labour, which, I do support it. It's historically made big differences to the conditions of workers in the northwest of England and around the country. But we've got to find a balance between the people that pay their taxes to support public services that we all massively value, and how we make sure that we get that the right way round. And the minimum safety level legislation that's coming through, that's being very roundly opposed, is about protecting people's right to have and use a safety service versus protecting people's right to strike. And I think we need to get that through and make it clear where that balance lies.
Well, it's OK saying you support the fundamental right to strike, but the government's actions fundamentally undermine that right to strike and mean that people can't take effective strike action. And this would have applied actually not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well. So at the end of this programme, I'm going up to Coventry to see Amazon workers who are striking for a decent pay rise. This law would have allowed Amazon to bring in agency workers to do the job of those striking workers. It would have exacerbated industrial relations, it would have lengthened the dispute. Even Margaret Thatcher didn't do this because she knew it would poison industrial relations, and that's why the High Court has said it's not only unlawful, it was an irrational decision by the government.
Well, we've already talked about pay rises. Let's get some specifics that we're hoping to hear from the Prime Minister, who is meeting with the Chancellor this morning and is about to state whether or not the pay review body's recommendations of between 6 and 6.5% pay rise across the public sector, they'll accept it. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Ione Wells. What's the latest, Ione?
Hi, Joe. Well, as you say, the Prime Minister and Chancellor have been meeting this morning to sign off what pay rises will be for different public sector workers. And the key question for public sector workers at the moment is, will they accept the recommendations that have been put forward by independent pay review bodies? Now, I've been told that those recommendations range from about 6 to 6.5% pay rises. What's tricky here is government departments had said in their submissions to these independent pay review bodies that they could budget for about 3.5% of a pay rise. So clearly a big shortfall there. The Chancellor has been pretty clear that he won't borrow more to fund any additional pay rises above what the government budgets have allowed for. So if the government does decide to accept pay rises of more than 3.5%, the chances are the government are going to say that will have to come out of existing government budgets and departmental budgets. So the challenge here, I think, and this will be something which I'm sure unions will comment on as soon as we have those figures, is if they don't match the independent pay review recommendations, that will be a concern from striking workers. If they do match them but say that they have to be funded by cuts from departments, I think that is also something that unions and public sector workers will not be particularly happy with. So I think we will expect probably later this afternoon to hear from the Treasury, from the Prime Minister, perhaps outlining their rationale for what decisions they will have made. But certainly I don't think this is the end of this dispute.
Ione Wells, thank you very much. Should the government accept the recommendations of the pay review bodies? Usually it does, if it's 6 to 6.5% for public sector workers.
Yeah, so I haven't seen them. I mean, that's the speculation on what's around it.
We're pretty sure that that's the range.
So that, I think the Prime Minister's only just about half an hour ago left the chamber. He's been talking about our support for Ukraine. So I think there maybe needs to be a bit of time before he can meet with the Chancellor.
Course. But what's your view? 6 to 6.5% pay review bodies. We're pretty confident that that's what they've recommended. Should the government accept it?
I think the government needs to get to whatever delivers on halving inflation, because inflation is the thing that makes us all poorer. And so I am not an economic brain, I'm a scientist, but I know that striking that balance between supporting people as, kind of some of the commodities that go flying up after the end of COVID and, Putin weaponising energy prices, we've got to but we cannot have inflationary pay rises, because it makes everybody poorer, and actually it kind of gives with one hand and takes away with the other.
Well, that's the government consideration. Should they accept the 6 to 6.5%, or do you agree with Catherine that actually there is a risk there in fuelling inflation?
I'm not sure I buy this argument about inflationary pressures, not least because, and I think this is one of the things the government genuinely has to take into consideration. If you look at the rate, what I think makes this set of industrial disputes different from where we've been in previous decades is that private sector pay is rising significantly. Yeah. And so this isn't just a question, important though it is, about the pound in people's pockets and people's ability to pay their bills, which you can totally understand why so many people are out on strikes, they're really struggling. It's also about the public sector's ability to recruit and retain our workforce.
So on that basis, would you accept the pay review body?
From the NHS? Well, we'll see what they recommend.
Let's say 6 to 6.5%.
All of our policies are fully costed and fully funded, Joe. So
you couldn't borrow more then if you want to stick to those fiscal rules?
We're really clear. Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules are very clear.
So you wouldn't accept
no borrowing for day-to-day inflation, but we would make different choices. And I'll give you some examples, going back to the point that Paul was making earlier about fair taxation. We have got the highest burden of taxation in this country for 70 years on people on low and middle incomes. Where Labour has sought to raise money for policies we want to put in our manifesto, look at the inherent fairness in there. The tax on non-DOMs, closing the carried profits loophole on private equity fund managers, abolishing the charitable status of private schools to fund the education of the 93% of people who go to... and we absolutely can tell you, I can tell you, having doing the rounds
how many state school students, how many private school students are now going to have to go into the state school as a result of the abolition of the
I do not buy the silly crocodile tears argument of the independent school sector. They put their fees up year after year after year, and parents pay them. It's just total. It's not the politics of envy. It's the politics of funding public services for the many.
The fundamental issue is there any evidence at all that it's the pay of school teachers or prison officers that's driving inflation in this country?
Well, why do you not think it is?
Well, because we've had year on year of real terms pay cuts. I mean, the average public sector worker in this country is £260 a month worse off than they were in 2010. The chief economist...
But inflation at that point was in a very different place.
The chief economist of the IMF has dismissed talk of a wage price spiral. And in fact, the governor of the Bank of England, I took a group of senior trade unionists in for a private meeting with the governor last week. But the Bank of England has been very cautious to talk about wage price spiral and has been very, very clear, even in its own analysis, it's the pay of top earners that potentially has some inflation effect, not public sector
to respond, let me show you, because Wes referred to the soaring pay rises in the private sector. You can see the difference between the private and the public sector from the Resolution Foundation, a 7.7% increase in the private sector. Is it fair, then, to present public sector workers with a far lower pay increase? As you can see here, look, it's rising there above the £600. It's sticking here, that's the private sector in the red, and here it has stagnated, if you like, under the public sector. Should the public sector, in a way, stay at that level while the private sector soars?
But the start date on that graph is January 22, and the public sector was protected from an awful lot of what happened after the financial crash.
Very true.
You know, you've got to start at 2008.
The difference between the public and the private sector... Sorry, the difference between the public and the private sector is, of course, the private sector pay is decided by supply and demand. The public sector is decided by the state.
Now, won't it fuel inflation in the same way?
So, this is where I actually agree with Paul here. Actually, you know, increasing public sector pay won't necessarily cause a wage inflationary spiral here. That's not the case. Inflation is caused because the Bank of England continuously increased the money supply. And the problem is that over the course of the pandemic, the Bank of England have been printing more money, effectively increasing the money supply, which means that there's too much money in the money supply chasing too few goods. That is why we have inflation, not because we're increasing spending or increasing any other area of government spending.
So you actually think they should get paid more in the public sector?
I think we need to think about the trade-offs. If we're going to increase public sector pay, we have to cut spending somewhere else.
Paul?
No, well, I don't think that's the case, and I think we'll go on to talk about tax. But let's put private sector pay into perspective for lots of people as well. That is still a real terms pay cut, a pay rise of 7.7%.
Yeah, I mean, it's not inflation, no.
I mean, I was talking to a group of bakers in Liverpool a couple of weeks ago on £11.43 an hour. That included their shift pay, their weekend pay, night pay, working bank holidays. Their employer, their parent company, made a profit of £1.44 billion.
Why is profit a bad thing?
It's not a bad thing, but it is when you're offering your own workforce a below-inflation pay rise. And that's why those workers were forced to take industrial actions. And, you know, the market doesn't always work, I'm afraid, Reem. Look at social care. We've got, 170,000 staff vacancies in social care? Low pay is endemic, insecure employment is endemic, pay is not rising in social care, the market is not fixing social care. Sometimes you have to have an active state and active policies.
First of all, think about the amount of government intervention we have in social care in the first instance. Secondly, when it comes to, I totally agree, there are huge amounts of vacancies both in the private and the public sector. The reason why is, first of all, there are 5.3 million people in out-of-work benefits that a lot of those people need to get back into work. Secondly, the second reason is, of course, the government are restricting immigration, so we actually can't fill in those vacancies.
I mean, throwing in benefits is a red herring. 70% of the kids who live in poverty in this country have at least one parent who goes out to work.
Well, and that is very true in terms of working families. Let me just show you, this is your solution to finding the money, which isn't something that the Labour Party is taking on, neither is the government. Tax, wealth and reward work. We must end the absurdity of nurses and teachers paying more of their income in tax than hedge fund traders. What sort of wealth taxes are you talking about?
Well, first of all, that's not just my solution. That was a joint op-ed that I did with Julian Richer from Richer Sound, who's a very successful entrepreneur and retailer. And we don't agree on everything, but we do agree that there needs to be a national debate about tax. Now, I don't expect Labour, for example, to set out all of its tax plans 12 or 15 months before an election.
Any of them.
Yeah. But what I do want is a sensible conversation about tax.
Well, what is that? So what do you want to see taxed?
Well, we've said, for example, at the TUC that we could look at equalising capital gains tax with income tax. We've said that we should explore the possibilities around wealth taxes. There are things that we can do because, as I said before, not everybody has been living through a cost of living crisis. The sales of Porsche motor cars in this country went up by a third last year. It was their record year for sales Clearly somebody's doing very well, and if you are doing well, you should expect to pay more tax.
Right, do you want to take on that debate? Is Labour going to really look at wealth taxes to try and pay for further investment in
I don't think Wes is going to come up with policy today.
I think I just described 3 examples where, in order to fund very good, very fair,
right,
very high impact policies, we would. Well, I tell you what, I'm definitely not sitting here on your programme announcing tax policy because I'll be shot by Rachel Reeves as soon as I walk back through the door.
But
the serious
idea,
point
I'm
is,
talking about the idea of it. Paul has written a piece, and what it does is it explores, as have other Labour MPs sitting in that seat, not on the front bench, saying we really, really need to look at wealth taxes as a way of raising revenue. Will you actually sit down and talk about it?
We do. We talk all the time about our tax and spending policies and about how we get the economy growing, how we make sure that Labour's manifesto is one that is achievable, credible and radical in terms of its impact, offering the change our country needs. And making sure this time it's change people can believe in, because for the last 4 general elections we've put forward manifestos, actually quite radically different across those 13 years.
So you're open to the idea of wealth
we lost
taxes.
every time. I've given you examples, Joe, of how Rachel, in order to fund our policies, have put taxes targeted at wealthier people, because she knows as well as I do that people on low and middle incomes are really
out
struggling.
Of this country. I mean, effectively, what the tax burden is doing at the moment is it's driving wealthy people, it's driving investment out of this country. We've already seen now with the recent budget, the corporation tax going up to 25%. That effectively drove out the AstraZeneca investment that was, I think it was worth £420 million. That's now been driven over to Ireland, which has a corporation tax of 12.5%. That's 50% lower than the United Kingdom. Would you reduce corporation tax?
Well, the reason why we've got a high tax economy is because we've got a low growth economy. And I'm afraid it does stick in the craw, doesn't it, that the Tories say, oh, it's really terrible, these inflationary pressures, and it's really difficult, we've got to balance these books. Well, of course it's difficult to balance the books when you went on a joyride with the economy and crashed the car and left everyone paying the price. Of course it's difficult to pay the bills when you've literally sent billions of pounds up in smoke in wasted PPE. The Tory party is very careless with other people's money all the time.
Wes,
very careless.
The PPE argument is the same as the private schools argument, which is you deploy a figure that sounds big and then spend it about 5 different times. Right. One of the Prime Minister's 5 priorities is grow the economy.
How's it going?
We have actually got the highest growth since 2010 of all of the European economies.
Right. It's 0.1%. They've just...
Don't worry, viewers. You've never had it so good. It's all going well here in Britain.
Oh, yeah, shut me down. Carry on. Right. Since 2010, we've grown the economy higher than anybody else. The corporation tax thing has got the super deduction within it. It's also got massive capital investment grants, because it doesn't make great kind of lines on a political TV show.
So why are companies like AstraZeneca leaving the United Kingdom?
Well, there's all sorts of reasons why there's a shortage of private sector investment in the UK economy. Partly we've got a government that's got no industrial strategy whatsoever, that's taken its eye off the ball in terms of how we get to net zero.
Literally just created a
but crucially, look at what's happened to growth. We've had no growth in the UK economy. In Spain, where they have introduced a wealth tax, faster growing economy than both France and Germany, there hasn't been an exodus of wealthy people. And I think you could walk down Bond Street or any of those big shopping streets in the UK. I don't think there's any evidence that the rich are fleeing the UK.
Well, let's talk about your book, Wes, because, yes, you're the Shadow Health Secretary. You also had a diagnosis of cancer, were treated on the NHS. Was that part of the inspiration for writing your memoirs?
Yeah.
You're very young to be writing your memoirs.
Initially I said no to the publisher because I think this is the sort of thing people do at the end of their careers, I hope this isn't like the career-ending memoir. The reason why fundamentally I wrote it is, I think, a couple of reasons, but it's a different story than most politicians would tell, and at a time when I think people find it hard to connect to politics and politicians, I hope that in some way it shows we're not all the same and not all born with a silver spoon in our mouth and not all in it for all the reasons that people read about in the newspapers. And the second thing is, as Keir was saying the other week, I genuinely think there's a class ceiling in this country. And I think there are things that I've learned through experience that have made a difference in my life. And yes, hard work and individual effort counts, but so too does secure and affordable housing. I would not be where I am today without a council house. So does a great state education. Would not be here without my teachers. My mum relied on a social security safety net, which I'm afraid barely exists in our country today. And it's not actually a political memoir, but in the final kind of chapter, I do kind of hit people on the nose with the politics because what breaks my heart is that kids that are growing up in my constituency from backgrounds like mine today, state schools in London might be better than they were in the 1980s.
You don't think they would be able to make it in the same way that you have?
No, they are being pushed from pillar to post in temporary accommodation. They don't get a chance to build a relationship with their teachers. The social security safety net is barely worthy of the name. I think there are so many things that have gone fundamentally wrong in terms of deep entrenched inequality in our society.
Catherine.
And that's the thing we've got to solve.
Well, Catherine, what about your story? Do you agree with Wes that there is a class ceiling that has existed, since 2010 when the Conservatives came in, or have you got a different version?
So when I heard about this, I had two kind of mischievous thoughts and one serious one. The first one was, does this count as a second job and were you just getting it in before Labour banned them? The second one was, is this a leadership bid? Because, we all know that, like the British public are starting to wise up to the fact that Keir Starmer will just say whatever he thinks that somebody wants to hear. But then the fair one is, people like us that come from different backgrounds do need to tell our stories to make sure that little Johnny or little Bob or little Margaret or, little Catherine or little Wes goes, oh, actually, we possibly can do that. If they've done it, there is a route, it can happen. People do expect politicians to be stinkingly posh, and not all of us are.
Yeah. But do you think a Catherine Fletcher now would be able to achieve what you have sitting here today?
I think education's the key to all of it. So that's why, the improvement that we've seen in the PISA league table since we put the education reforms in 2010. The school I went to, I used to travel to go to access an amazing education. But the school that was round the corner has been shut. It was that bad. The year I graduated my GCSEs, that school got 15% A to C GCSE passes, whereas the state school I was at got 92. Now, that level of gap in the 80s and 90s stops, and the focus on education and then allowing people to catch up, lifetime skills guarantee, switch into apprenticeships and T-levels. I think the most disastrous thing that the Labour government did was make that 50% university pledge. I think, we've had to write that with apprenticeships, T-levels, retraining in adult skills, because it was giving people skills that the job market didn't want to kind of break a social mobility barrier. And it was well-meaning but wrong in its labour market effect.
Wes?
I think the 50% target was transformational in terms of getting more working-class kids to universities. I agree we need to focus on the other 50%. That's a big plank of what Bridget Phillipson and Keir Starmer were saying the other week. The one thing I would say, though, is that under the last Labour government, the attainment gap between kids from the richest and poorest backgrounds was narrowing and child poverty was falling. We're now seeing those trends slip into reverse. And I think that's one of the many things that will make it harder for kids growing up in working class backgrounds to do as well as their welfare.
Tell us a little bit more about the story, your working class background. One boy, two bills and a fry-up. It's a great title. It does rather draw you in. Who were the two bills?
The two bills are my two grandparents, Bill Streeting, World War II Navy veteran, civil engineer throughout his life. Working class Tory. Catherine would have got on with him.
Did you not?
No, actually, he was the most important person in my life. I loved him very, very much. But on politics, no. And then my other granddad was an armed robber, not a very successful one, which is why he was in and out of prison throughout my mum's childhood and my childhood. And the fry-up was the fry-up that saved my life, because my mum, as a young mum, teenage mum, was under a lot of pressure to have an abortion. So she did the one thing she wasn't supposed to do on the day of the termination, which was to cook herself a full English breakfast. So here I am today, thanks to a fry-up.
Listening to both the stories and growing up in sort of Thatcher's time, both of you, but coming to very different conclusions politically. Can you see where Catherine is coming from?
I think there'll always be individuals that get on, but I think we've got a broad issue. I think the class ceiling is alive and well. I mean, 7% of kids in this country go to private school, and yet when I talk to company chief executives, when I talk to people in the media, disproportionately they're represented in our politics, disproportionately represented in our politics. And I do think we have to think more about how we support working class kids, not just through school or college or university, but throughout their working lives. I mean, we haven't got a functioning careers advice and guidance system in this country. So, I mean, when I was young and growing up in a similar sort of background, working class sort of background on Merseyside, I got an offer to come and work down in London actually as an intern for an independent media
And you can't
company.
afford to do it, can you?
And I couldn't. And they said, well, obviously you'd have to support yourself. I was like, I can't go to London for 2 months without a wage. I mean, how would that work? So I stayed in Asda.
Well, so I think that the huge divide that we're seeing at the moment is actually not class, but it's intergenerational divide. Now we're seeing Gen Z are effectively going to be the first generation in the last century that will be poorer than their parents. That's partly as a result of course, inflation, which is caused by the Bank of England's increase of the money supply and quantitative easing measures. It's also as a result of the housing crisis. And unfortunately, the government are now at the moment restricting housing supply, which means that effectively it's economics 101. If you increase the supply, those prices will go down. And it means that the younger generations at the moment aren't able to afford their own homes because the government are actively restricting house building. Now, I think I would like to see the next government actually support house building and build more homes. I think that is really the key issue here for young people, and that is where the huge inequalities really lie.
All right, just finally, Catherine's other question. You want to be leader?
Well, I was going to say to Catherine, actually, you'll be having a leadership election a lot sooner than we will. I mean, they come around every 5 minutes,
deflection,
and God knows who we're going to end up with next.
But you want to be leader.
By the time, let me tell you this: by the time there is a Labour leadership election, there's going to be a new generation of Labour MPs saying, "Thanks, Wes, for all you did as Health Secretary. Now go and write your next memoir."
Volume 2.
Now.
Volume 2, you'll be like Alistair Campbell. The Guardian, US and UK call for more gratitude from Kyiv after Zelensky's NATO complaint. Big sigh there from you. Speaking at the NATO summit in Lithuania, Ben Wallace recalled driving 11 hours last summer to arrive in Ukraine and be greeted with a long list of requests for arms, which is what, to some extent, prompted this "they need to show more gratitude." Was he wrong?
I think this may be, in the famous words of the late Queen, a recollections may differ moment, but our commitment to Ukraine is kind of leading in Europe. You know, it's 4.6 billion quid. We were the first to send them tanks. We were the first to train the pilots.
And are they showing enough gratitude?
We were the first to send them long-term messages. If you look at the Defence of Ukraine Twitter account, which I follow, they're constantly posting pictures of us, like, training their troops in Salisbury and supporting them. It's... What are we doing here? We're trying to protect Europe and support the Ukrainians to get an unprecedented war, get the Russians off their land, and we're doing a cracking job of it.
Right, so are they showing enough gratitude, the Ukrainians?
What? The Ukrainians...
So Ben Wallace was wrong?
The Ukrainians don't care. They want the Russians out of their back garden. Everybody is grateful for the help that they're getting, because they are the front line of a war against someone that was trying to weaponise energy prices.
Was he wrong?
He was. It seemed to me to be an uncharacteristic outburst and a very unfortunate one. We should be thanking Ukraine not just for their existential battle, but for standing up for freedom and democracy on our own continent. Similarly, if I can say, I think the Prime Minister's tweet about the Labour Party and NATO yesterday, which he doubled down on today, was petty, small. And what do we want people, our enemies, looking at?
I was so behind Oliver Dowden.
What do we want?
Angela Rayner stood up and had to go at him for being there because the Prime Minister wasn't there.
Hang on a
second. Well, he's either at NATO or at the dispatch box. He can't do both.
We're not divided on Ukraine. And we don't want our enemies to think we're divided on Ukraine. And we're not divided on NATO either. We should be sending a strong, united and powerful message to this country's enemies that whoever's in government, Labour or Conservative, we will stand up for Ukraine, stand up for UK defence and security. And under Keir Starmer's leadership, there is no question about that whatsoever.
Just before we continue, we're just hearing in the Commons, John Glenn in the Treasury team has said that the government accepts the pay review recommendations for public sector pay in full. And in a moment, I'll get you the exact figure, but we are thinking between 6 and 6.5%. Was Ben Wallace wrong to say that they need to show more gratitude?
I think the language was really unhelpful. I think we all want to stand with the people of Ukraine, and certainly in the TUC, we've been working directly with our Ukrainian counterparts, and we're also thinking about what is the road to peace and resolving the conflict. And I have to say, I was really disappointed. The UK government a couple of weeks ago hosted a conference on reconstruction in the Ukraine, and the one civil society actor not invited was Ukrainian trade unions.
Yes or no? Was he wrong?
He was definitely wrong, and I think that we need to remember not to bow down to aggressors. Putin and Putin's Russia is aggressive. I
need to get your response. Wes, yes, Rishi Sunak has approved the following public sector pay rises: teachers 6.5%, junior doctors 6%, police 6%, and so on. Was that the right decision?
Well, I'm glad the government are able to accept the pay review body's recommendations, because we've got to build confidence in the independent pay review body process.
Let's make sure they fund those pay rises as well.
Absolutely.
They might come from existing budgets, of course. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.